I'm Sydney Soderberg. Welcome to the final panel discussion of this year's Summer Solstice program. Martha Ray, Paula Freed, and I hope you have found that the information that's been presented has helped you develop new insights on resilience. We welcome any comments you might have about this year's program, along with suggestions for topics you'd like us to explore for next year's Summer Solstice. You can send us a message to nicole@fpcsalina.org. And don't forget, Summer Solstice lives on and continues to be available on YouTube and First Presbyterian's Facebook.
Welcome. This year's Summer Solstice series is focused on resilience, with the hope that we can learn something about getting through a challenging time like this well, living well, and struggling well. Today, in this final session of our series, we're going to explore specific strategies and practices that can help increase our capacity to deal with adversity. We're very fortunate to have three experts with us today who bring a wide range of experience to this topic, and I am delighted to introduce them to you. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge Martha Ray and Sydney Soderberg, who created Summer Solstice 10 years ago and have continued to nurture its growth with great care and wisdom. You may not see them on the screen right now, but their presence is evident in every one of these conversations. They've brought a wonderful gift to our community, and it's been a great privilege to be part of this project. And now to our panelists. First, Chris Sexton. Chris is an experienced therapist and researcher who specializes in treating anxiety disorders in early childhood through adulthood. She has over 15 years of working as a scientist clinician with multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals. She's a frequent presenter in professional settings and a variety of other settings as well. She grew up here in Salina, and after undergraduate school in KU and graduate degrees from Columbia University in New York, she has settled in Kansas City. Chris says, as the mother of two children, I am continually reminded of how much I still have to learn about parenting and child development. Welcome, Chris.
Word. Thank you.
And we also have with us Melinda Jett. Melinda Jett graduated from Kansas Wesleyan University with a degree in English and secondary education. A Salina native, she lived in Chicago for several years before she and her husband returned to Salina to raise their two now adult children. She's been teaching English at Central High School for the past 10 years and has held leadership roles around our community. She says, the last 2 years have been especially tough for all educators, parents, and students. Honest relationships and relatable curriculum are even more important than ever for an atmosphere of learning to occur. Welcome, Melinda.
Thank you.
And we have with us John Earl, a Brooklyn-based multimedia producer. From 2019 to 2022, he was host and lead producer of Road to Resilience, a Mount Sinai Health System podcast featuring resilience stories and expert insights, which is how we came to know John. The podcast was nominated for AMBI and Webby Awards and named a COVID-19 must listen by Apple Podcasts. A former print reporter in Moscow, John has worked across mediums in a wide range of storytelling projects, including about corruption in Russia, undocumented immigrants, and soul music. John says, few joys are sweeter than clearly articulating a powerful idea for the first time. Welcome, John.
Thank you.
So now I'm gonna ask Chris to get us started and tell us a little bit about what you bring to this topic and what you can teach us about resilient practices.
Thank you, Paula. I'm going to share a PowerPoint here. And as I bring that up for you guys, hold on. Let's see how this works. Paula, does that look okay to you?
We can still see the slide bar. Is it
Okay.
presentation view that you want, maybe?
Now, here we go. How about that?
There we go, perfect, okay.
Okay. So as Paula said, I am a Salina native, and I just want to acknowledge what an honor it is to be in this space. I also was a member of the First Presbyterian Church growing up. And I was always really intrigued by the adult programming, which I always saw as so rich. There were always a lot of things going on, both in the adult Sunday school realm and then in amazing series like these. So I was always wondering what was going on behind closed doors there. And now I get to be a part of it in this way. It's just really an honor. So I am going to, oh, look, I didn't even know I did that. Look at that fancy fade in. I'm going to talk about resilient processes here today, which is our topic. And I come from a place of developmental psychopathology as my framework, and was fortunate to study with Sonia Luther at Columbia University, who's one of the kind of thought leaders in this space of resilience. And she, among other people, including Froma Walsh, whom you guys heard from last session, really have emphasized that resilience is a dynamic process. It's not a trait. And even at the time I was in grad school, it was still really seen in that way. And even now, people talk about, oh, they're resilient or they're not very resilient. But I think the importance of the wealth of research we now have is that it really has demonstrated that resilience is something we can practice and cultivate over time. The foundation of resilience really is connection. And we talk a lot in the research now about responsive caregiving, and there's a lot of unpacking of that and what is it that that creates that space. But I don't think anyone has ever said it better than Toni Morrison in an interview with Oprah Winfrey, where she talked about that moment when your child walks into the room. Do your eyes light up? And that sums up to me so much in terms of what does it look like in action when we're talking about that connection and relationships, and especially that importance of having at least one trusted adult. Now, Toni Morrison goes on to say, well, as parents, we are focused on, hey, is your hair combed? Did you brush your teeth? Are the shoes tied? And we think that our love is on display in that, because that is caregiving. But that's not all the child sees. Is what now? What didn't I do right now? And so if we can all kind of hold that in mind, I think for me that was really powerful. Importantly, for Oprah Winfrey, she says later that she reflected on that, and she knew that was important because it was something she hadn't had. But she said, I did know my value. I found it other ways, and I did cultivate resilience, but I found that at church. So I want to also have us be thinking about the importance of all different ways of developing those important connections and relationships with trusted adults. So I want to talk about, I think I have 4 factors here. I'm going to try to buzz through them. Number 1 is caregiving capacity. The best way to strengthen children's resilience is to strengthen their parents' resilience. And we know that toxic stress is transmitted across generations. And so is resilience as a practice again. And so when we think about helping, folks who are at risk or in stressful situations, to me, as a person focused on child and teen development in this presentation, there's no greater, more powerful thing we could do than bolster that caregiving capacity of their parents. So that can happen through emotional and practical support. I think we all needed a lot more of that as parents in this pandemic. That can happen from family, friends, from religious groups, professionals, by connecting in activities that are enjoyable, meaningful, and restorative. And in my own practice as an anxiety specialist, I often see that while the child or the teen may be the way a family gets into my office, they may be the identified patient. This person has a problem. It's often the case that parents also can really benefit from mental health treatment. One example of a program level practice designed to bolster resilience is 2Gen Thrive. And that is a 8-week psychotherapy group designed for parents. And it was developed by Dr. Brianna Woods-Jager. And I was fortunate to collaborate with her. We developed and pilot tested that together at Children's Mercy Hospital here in Kansas City. And then we're continuing to evaluate subsequent kind of iterative adaptations of the group embedded in the perinatal visit schedule. So one of my best friends is a gynecologist at University Health, formerly Truman, and we've all partnered together, even though Dr. Woods-Jager is now at Emory, on a multi-site study that's looking at how that could help at the earliest, before parents are even parents, right? In that during the period of pregnancy, giving opportunities to teach and provide a space for emotion regulation skills. So that's been super rewarding. I'll say just one piece about that is that the larger aim of that work is really also to ameliorate racial health disparities. And so our current focus is on Black women specifically, but we have looked at a range of outcomes in that group. So number 2, protective factors. So accepting all thoughts and feelings as a practice, this is incredibly powerful. And then also, as Paula and I discussed before we met here, it's also kind of like underwhelming. Sometimes it's kind of a hard sell. People are like, wait, I came to see you so that I could get rid of my anxiety. Now you're just saying, accept it. It's sometimes something that we have to, the best way I know how to explain it actually is to say, okay, what are all the strategies you've tried so far to try to get rid of the thoughts and feelings you don't want to be having? And people usually come in with a pretty good list. And hey, if anything's working and it's helping you, it's, let's keep it on the table. But oftentimes we find that the more we try to push away and control thoughts and feelings, the more they spring up, and often at inopportune times, and the more they get in our way. And it's a lot of energy focused on pushing down and away thoughts and feelings. Similarly, trying to talk children out of how they're thinking or feeling never works, even when they're clearly wrong, as my kids sometimes are in their excessive, emotional outbursts. Saying that doesn't ever help. I think parent to parent, we can all agree. And so trying a different way, mindfulness and other coping skills, emotion check-ins are good examples of practices around this. All of it is about opening yourself fully to experience the moment as it is, not as your mind says it is. And over time, the more you model and the more you validate thoughts and feelings, the more children and teens are able to look at their thoughts rather than from their thoughts. The biosocial model is a model that developmental psychologists have put out as an example of how emotion dysregulation develops. And I always think it's useful to learn from how things are when they're not working, to kind of also then help inform something like resilience, which is doing well under conditions of high stress. So we see on this diagram, and this was actually developed by Marsha Linehan as part of her work in dialectical behavioral therapy, that we have this biological vulnerability that everyone kind of comes at a certain set point. There are some folks who are just going to be more vulnerable to strong emotions, more sensitivity, more reactivity, slower return to baseline. And over time, that leads to a lot of different interpersonal problems and can lead to mental health problems like anxiety and depression and other types of difficulties regulating emotions. But before that happens, it transacts with something in the middle. And this, I believe, is our greatest opportunity as caregivers. and as important adults in children and teens' lives. This is the opportunity to create either a validating social environment where folks are taught that they're right to feel how they feel, because feelings just are. We don't get to change those directly, or they're given the message directly or indirectly that they're overreacting, that they're trying to manipulate us by doing and acting a certain way. So the real antidote to that biosocial model of psychopathology is validation. And in the simplest of terms, this is something I'll often put on my whiteboard at work when I'm working with teens and parents, and I'll just have everyone try doing this together in session. You're feeling sad, and that makes sense because you're upset about what happened at lunch today, and taking a guess as to what that is, and preparing to be wrong is what we're doing in these kinds of moments, right? Preparing to be wrong, meaning sometimes when we try to validate, the other person says, well, that's not it. And you're like, okay, got it. So that I didn't quite hit it right. Was the emotion right? Is sadness, I think that's what I'm picking up on. And you're kind of just helping to allow the other person in that moment to make sense of their own emotions. And what that requires first is just figuring out what they're feeling. And then sometimes it's so hard to articulate that when you're worried that the reason isn't good enough, right? And before we can even look at thoughts or do anything else, we have to really do this stage. And sometimes I believe as parents, we're so eager to problem solve that we hustle past this. We skip this really important moment. Protective factor number 3, and I think these are kind of, hopefully you're seeing building on one another, is connecting with value-driven activities. And when we're thinking again about children and teens, which is kind of my focus here today, it's often kind of thinking of opportunities for parents and teens to be and kids to be together. And in those moments, we're taking a break from all the teaching, right? We're taking a break from the commands, the criticisms, the questions, and we're just focusing on enjoying one another. And I think this is one maybe benefit that came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, is there was more time that opened up. Many of us saw our frenetic soccer driving schedules and things replaced by just a lot of downtime. And that also, of course, included tremendous competing demands and pressures to try to also work while your kids are in school, and all of that craziness. But I think there's also sometimes those moments for opportunities to just find ways of being together. And we actually see in some of the research that's now coming out that parents who use techniques that, and this is an interesting phrase, limit adolescents' autonomy, that was actually protective against pandemic-related anxiety and depression. And I think that's really interesting. I've seen something really similar in my practice, which is that, that kids who were able to maintain some kind of daily schedule with boundaries, with some balance, with limits on their screen time, and opportunities to still connect with people, that was really helpful. And then I think, if we aren't trying to change how we think and feel, what an opportunity to do what we care about. And so if we can just validate emotions, if we can accept our thoughts and feelings, we can bring all that with us and do what matters, do something that feels good to us, or maybe it doesn't even feel good. Maybe it's uncomfortable, but it is something that we know is going to be a good challenge for us, or is going to help someone else. And that's that idea of values and helping children connect with the values that are behind some of the things that they do, and highlighting for them. I love the creativity that comes out when you are drawing. And that's like a deeper value, right? It's not just, that they're drawing, it's what's that deeper value that really enhances the experience. And then finally, my favorite protective factor, which is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. And I have a mug that I use daily to sip tea from with that saying. And I have it for myself as much as anyone else, right? Because I like being comfortable. I'm not always comfortable being uncomfortable, but today I had to be a little uncomfortable. At the start of this, I felt my heart rate kind of increase, and I didn't want to say something stupid, right? I want to look good in this moment, and we all have fears that come in all kinds of situations. And the idea of an exposure is doing things that are things on purpose without trying to change our thoughts and emotions, and doing those things that are difficult for us. And when we're doing an exposure, it's not just that, it's different from life throwing those things at us. It's us seeking those out in a gradual, systemic fashion. And sometimes, whether with kids, teens, or adults, we're rewarding ourselves for the different milestones and things that we do as we move forward with that. So I did put up here an example of what we call an exposure hierarchy. And this is for social anxiety in the context of the COVID pandemic. And you can see on here, the first level is playing Xbox with a friend, and that's a 3. And the 3 refers to the subjective units of distress scale. It's just like a 0 to 10 scale. And I'm always asking people to kind of think about ways, things that are pushing them outside their comfort zone in service of, things that are going to take them closer to the life they want to have, not just for no reason, unless the goal is I want to increase my flexibility, which, by the way, is a huge factor, resilience protective factor. So these are just some examples. So this is probably an amalgam of things. I've done all of these things with different teens, starting with something as simple as, staying in your house in the safety of your house, which for many folks with social anxiety feels better, but not just playing alone on your Xbox, doing it with a friend. Now we're thinking, okay, what about having a friend over? How high would that be? And a lot of times that's a little higher. So let's start there. And then when you do it, let's see how that feels. Let's see, maybe we did stay anxious the whole time. Maybe the anticipatory anxiety, beforehand was even greater than having the friend over. But either way, we learned something, either that our prediction was kind of distorted based on fear, or that we can handle it, and we got through it. And then I can't tell you how many exposures I've done at Chipotle. That's a really important skill that, man, people like our teens do not know how to order in person. And I don't know if this was always the case, but I have so many people I see whose parents always order for them, and the kid will say what they want, but they don't want to, say it out loud to the server. Now, Chipotle is even more daunting because all those toppings, the salsas, it's just a lot of things that you've got to say. And so that could be one. And I'm not going to read them all, but I will say one success story yesterday that a 16-year-old gave me permission to share, obviously with confidentiality protected, but she came in just owning this exposure thing. And man, like, this was something that had been a hard sell, but she had made this thing that was way cooler than anything I could, using an iPad application with like one of those little pencils. And it was her summer exposure acknowledgement extravaganza. And the acknowledgement was to recognize that there were a lot of opportunities for exposures that were built into her day without her planning, something like going to Chipotle. Like one day she was having worried thoughts that her friend might not like her. And instead of trying to reassure herself that those aren't true, or like asking a bunch of people things, she just thought, yeah, that could be true. And I don't know for sure. And then she went back to her day. So she kind of leaned in to what was risky there, which was the uncertainty. So she got it big time. And every day of the summer so far had a different exposure that she had done, culminating with wearing cosplay to an anime convention, as one does. So that's exposure. And I think it is a really robust tool that is maybe kind of underutilized that I love to talk about. And those are all of my slides.
Thank you, Chris. Lots to consider there. Melinda, I'm going to ask you to go next.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank Paula and Sydney and Martha for inviting me to this conversation and trusting that I have something to add to this important conversation that we're having today. And just like you, Chris, I watched the last summer solstice and I was taken aback with some of the things that Froma Walsh said. For example, many of them that you mentioned here today, that resiliency is sometimes more innate in some people. And some people are born with more personal resources. Some people face more daunting obstacles. And some of us just encounter more barriers. But that this art of resiliency isn't about our personality traits or maybe timelines or events, but creating practices and creating those solid practices and responsive practices that allow us to make meaning out of our lives. So as an educator, that was music to my ears because I see that with my young people. And I think that one of the main jobs of an educator is creating practices. And oftentimes it's creating practices for communication, for organization, for how to store information, how to access information. But probably most importantly, it's creating these practices for resiliency. I am by no means an expert and I don't have any hardcore answers. I just do what feels right to me, do what feels right when I'm working with young people. And I have learned the practices that have helped me through the last couple of years in these challenging times. And I just try and bring those to the classroom in a very honest way. Because we need a resilient humanity and maybe even more a resilient young generation because they are the narrative our young people are hearing is fairly doomsday and it's reposted and reposted and reposted for them. And so it's just this recurring dialogue. There was an article recently in The Atlantic that talked about mindfulness. And it said that few people are able to practice mindfulness because it is such hard work. And to stay present to stay in the present moment and deliberately change one's inner and outer dialogue and not default to a past narrative is very difficult for most people, especially young people. And to me, this ability to be mindful is really what practicing resilience is. For young people, and these are all real examples that I've encountered, it means how do I get up and go to school and learn when A, boyfriend breaks up with me via text the night before. Mom says repeatedly how stupid I am at math. Grandma screams at me every morning because she is angry that she is raising me because my parents are not able to do that. Girl's father was arrested the night before and has to go to the neighbors to gather bail money to get her father out of jail. And then just the Snapchat stories that sometimes kids post that other kids read, and they read them right before they walk into school. So for me, the teacher's work is to listen and help to facilitate kind of this resiliency dialogue. For example, how do I work through this? What can I learn from this moment? What am I feeling? What do I want as an outcome for this situation? How do I make meaning of this when my spirit is crushed? And then sometimes just how am I going to get through this day? So there are a couple of resiliency practices I think I use in my classroom, and I use that term loosely because I never called them resiliency practices before. But upon the learning of the last few months, I think that's what they are. And they just have felt right when working with young people. So first, I begin each school year with the beautiful and powerful TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie called The Danger of the Single Story that probably many of you are familiar with. Adichie speaks at ease at which people deduce other people or groups of people to a single story. And that's either an adjective or a descriptor that defines all of them. We talk through examples of stereotypes. We talk through when the media spun a story, when we have decided that we know who or how somebody is by either a single story that we've heard from somebody else about them or one that we've created ourselves. And even how other people might single story us. It's such a powerful lesson in the classroom when young people realize how this single narrative dictates our opinions and really halts potential relationships. A couple of examples I have are, oh, she's an athlete, I'm not an athlete, we don't have anything in common. Or he's a frat boy, he must have life so easy. She's Black, I'm white, we care about different things. Some students have even turned this into a verb. I had a young girl say, okay, she came into my room last year and she said, oh, Mrs. Jett, I so single storied her. When I really got to know her, she was such a nice girl. And so I love that they're able to apply this in their real relationships with people at school. We refer to this lesson all year long in our conversations, and I think it relates to the resiliency practice because it requires us to stop and evaluate our inner dialogue and to reassess our thinking and maybe even better yet, our responses. And then ultimately to learn more about ourselves and others. Second, because I'm an English teacher, some of the best literature is all about resiliency. Young person encounters a problem. Young person struggles how to overcome the problem. Young person figures out alternatives. Young person learns and moves forward. So the character allows young people to watch and learn how, and again, quoting Roma Walsh, she put it, struggle well. So at first, by viewing this in a character form, students can do it in a non-confrontive, non-personal way. And they can witness a character facing adversity, revising his or her responses, and then can transfer that meaning to and apply it to other people around them who have also maybe faced adversity and faced trauma and have found that hope and that purpose. And then ultimately, of course, the goal is to apply that resiliency practices with themselves. So we ask some of these hard questions when we're doing that of our characters and then ultimately of barriers that we might be facing too. So where am I stuck? What are my options? What were the character's options? Am I stuck in a blame narrative? Is the character stuck in a blame narrative? How can I use what the character learned as inspiration in my own journey? And I think it's super important that the classroom is a safe space to not only analyze these characters, but also a space to struggle with our own barriers and find that connection between the two. So as a teacher, I try and choose pieces that fit my students and also the current dialogue they're hearing. I look for stories that encourage their minds to process and think and examine life from multiple perspectives. I choose characters from written literature, I bring in podcasts, I bring in real life stories. And it seems sometimes young people are a little bit fixated on social media story, and that's sometimes one of doom and gloom polarity. And so that's their recurring narrative, but also it might be a family's narrative of the world is against us, or we can never catch a break. And that might be the cycle that they are processing the obstacles they're facing with. So strong, resilient characters offer us an example of hope. These come from classic literature, of course, but I am finding that current literature is speaking to our young people with more potency. A couple I use in the recent years is I use Jeanette Wall's memoir, The Glass Castle. And I find that Walls shows that she has every reason to blame her life on her parents' dysfunction. But instead, she finds those moments of gratitude and those moments where she takes the pen into her own hands and writes her own story ending. And unfortunately, we have way too many young people who can relate to this story narrative. The second one, the one more recently I'm using, is an author, Nick Stone, and she writes, the book we use in school is called Dear Martin, and it's about a young Black boy in a predominantly white environment, and he's struggling with where he fits and where he belongs. And again, what young person has not also struggled with that question of where they fit and where they belong? My favorite line from that book is when Mama says to the young man, "You ever consider that maybe you're not supposed to fit? People who make history rarely do." What a concept for young people to ponder. And I love it because sometimes I think the world says that in order to fit, you need to look like this or be this or do this or act like this. So those are just a couple examples that I use in my classroom. But I think, Paula, I'm also here to talk about how I've practiced resiliency myself as an educator, particularly in the last couple of years. And education is changing and evolving right now, and schools are being challenged. So there are many conversations regarding best practices and emphases. And of course, this has been magnified in the last couple of years with also the pandemic and other national crises we are facing. We have, besides just the conversations about grade cards and standardized testing, restorative justice, book banning, safety for our students and our teachers. The real push lately is the social emotional conversation. And that's, in my opinion, a little bit why we're having this conversation. So some of the dialogue that's happening around that is schools used to be teacher-centered, then schools moved to student-centered, and now schools need to be relationship-centered. And relationship drives education. So teachers need to show up at their very, very best every day, every hour, for every student. And that's sometimes tough. So as far as personal resiliency practices, I have had to reevaluate and kind of make meaning of challenges facing education and in our world today. I've had to be mindful and look at my own practices that help me kind of find my inner and outer voice among the adversity. So first I asked myself, what do the young people need from me? And I answered that with, overall, they need my love. They need me to believe in their abilities and their potential. They need me to respect their individual journeys. And daily, they need me to be consistent, stable, positive, yet honest. And they need clear expectations amidst the outside chaos. So I needed to be present with them, and I needed to listen to them and understand their fears, their joys, their concerns, their humanity. And so I needed to change some of my own personal practices in order to be there more fully for the students. And quite honestly, to honor and value my own personal well-being in the last couple of years. So while the classroom practices might be a little more creative, these are just practical. First is I quit reading the news. I was letting media negatively affect me, and I needed to take control of the energy I was allowing to penetrate me. I still keep up on the news, but I do not let myself go down that rabbit hole of commentary anymore. It was unhealthy for me. Two, I love nature and being outdoors. And I needed to find more time for that in my life. So I used to go into work at 5:30 in the morning because that was the quiet time and that's when I could get a lot done. And in the last couple of years, I replaced that with an outdoor walk. So I get up, I walk outdoors, it clears my mind, it sets the tone for my day. I might have to stay a little later after school, but I begin that way every morning. And then just overall taking better care of myself. In order to be there more fully for my students, I needed to focus on some practices like getting a good night's rest, going to bed earlier, finding out what vitamins I needed, eating healthier, just practical things that enabled me to be that stable, consistent presence every day for the young people. And practical practices in my classroom, just a couple I want to talk about. One would be grading practices, because if we want to, we can bring home hours every night of grading. And I knew I really needed to separate that time for me from school and home. And so I just kind of decided, and other people too, I believe, that not all assignments need to be graded. Some can be for practice, and then choosing specifically which ones were worth the time to grade and give that solid feedback to young people. Working on coming up with 3 to 5 questions versus 20 questions. Just some very practical grading practices that established that separation for home for Melinda and school for Mrs. Jett. And then secondly is making more time in the classroom just to connect with one another, to work together, to poke holes in the single stories that we had and have about each other, to being okay with the quiet and the stillness, and allowing students to organize their thoughts and to respectfully respond to each other. That sometimes means completely scratching a lesson plan. That sometimes means coupling a couple of different assignments and trying to handle things that way, so that we weren't so tied to a clock, but yet tied to that organic learning and relationship building that we needed. And I felt like this was even more important after we were given the option to shed our masks in the spring, because those were such a physical barrier to any relationship building for people, but with the young people whom I worked with. So we really needed time to reconnect and to build those relationships again. Dr. Bruce Perry says that the more healthy relationships a child has, the more likely he will be able to recover from trauma and thrive. And relationships are the agents for change, and the most powerful therapy is human love. Well, that's a practice I can control. So I can't control the roller coaster of challenges that my students face every day, but I can control my resiliency practices, both in the classroom and personally, so that I can present a trusted relationship for the young people, and probably most importantly, human love.
Thank you, Melinda. That's just beautiful. John, you're next.
Wow, thank you so much, Melinda and Chris. I'm just like, I feel like we're already well into a masterclass on resilience. And I as I was listening to you both, I just couldn't help but thinking how fortunate your students and patients are to be working with you. So thank you both. And thank you also to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So as Paula mentioned, I'm a podcast producer first and foremost. I spent the last 3 years working at the Mount Sinai Health System in New York City, making a podcast about resilience, an interview podcast, which meant that I interviewed all sorts of different people, everyone from comedians to Olympic athletes to neuroscientists to trauma survivors to 9/11 survivors. And what I was looking for were exactly what we're talking about today, which are the habits of mind, the practices, the things that I was hoping I could learn and that my listeners could learn from people and experts on resilience. I'll say two things before I kind of dig into what I learned over the 3 years and 70 plus episodes. First is that I come at this as a documentarian, not an expert. I don't have a background in psychology, so I just want to put that up front, that what I share is not medical advice whatsoever. And then the second thing I would want to say is that I was interested both in the classical definition of resilience, which is you're at a baseline, something happens, and how long and through what methods you return to your baseline. I'm also interested in people who are still working on it, who haven't figured out, who are struggling, who are trying different things in the resilience toolkit. So I feel like I learned as much from those people. I interviewed some people with terminal illnesses. There's a form of resilience there, even for people who are not going to return to the previous baseline. And so in terms of what I learned, I'm so grateful to all the people I interviewed who, were vulnerable and shared their stories with me, particularly in terms of summarizing all of the guests. I'm very grateful to a researcher at Columbia named George Bonanno, who's written a lot about resilience, and he studies resilience explicitly. He was actually one of the few people who is a dedicated resilience researcher who I interviewed. And so some of these takeaways I'm borrowing a bit because they so perfectly summarize a lot of what I encountered. And so the first big takeaway is that resilience is surprisingly common. We often think, and I certainly thought going into this project, that I was going to be interviewing these rare, extraordinary, resilient people, and they're somehow different from us, and maybe they're born with it, or maybe they're just supernaturally, brave and tough and gritty. And in fact, my experience and Dr. Bonanno's and others' research has made it very clear that many of us, in fact, most of us, after going through an adverse experience, will, with certain supports and through their own resources, return to that baseline that I referred to. And I think that is really inspiring to me, just to be like, oh gosh, well, that means that I can be resilient. That means that all of us don't have to be quite so fearful. We don't have to feel that we're so fragile. This is something that's accessible to all of us. And the second thing, and I think this is important, is that we don't have to think of people. Let me see how I would want to say this. People who are struggling are not broken. People who go through difficult experiences are not broken. I think there's a sort of stigma that attaches itself to people who've been through trauma, and we think that, oh, they're like, deeply disturbed or changed, and they can never be whole and feel whole again. And I think it's important to bring everybody into the conversation and bring people into our community, even if they've been through difficult experiences and even if they're struggling. So that's why I love that sort of insight that resilience is actually quite common and is not as rare as we think it is. And the other main big takeaway before I get into some of the specific practices that Melinda and Chris have already started to outline so well is that there's no one way to be resilient. I think that's a theme that we've already established here. There are many ways to be resilient. The internet is full of practices, really good, healthy habits, things like mindfulness, things like exercise, things like taking care of your body, getting good sleep, social support we've already talked about. But the key seems to be flexibility. It's the ability to reach into the toolkit, to use practices, to try things out, to go through a trial and error process. And something, when you go through an adverse experience, not to think that there's any one way to return to a healthy baseline. And I want to establish that, it's never returning to who you were before. It's returning to a different you, the person who's grown. We talk about post-traumatic growth, the person who's grown and changed as a result of an adverse experience. In fact, focusing on post-traumatic growth can be itself a tool in the resilience toolkit. Think about what I've learned rather than what I've lost. So the idea of the toolkit also means that things that may seem unhealthy, maybe at first glance, can actually be part of this trial and error process. For example, we might think that, oh, someone who's been through adversity who's now watching TV, maybe they're just numbing themselves out. Maybe, but maybe they're just distracting themselves in a helpful way, that for a period of time can be a helpful tool. You know, let me think of another one that I had written down. Oh, and, you know, sometimes people can restrict their social circles to a very small group, and that can be isolating, or that can be sort of going inward and regrouping. So I present those two examples just as, you know, one of the many examples, in addition to some we've already talked about, of things that people who are being flexible and being proactive in their journey can try, can pick up, can put down, can pick up something else and put something else down. So 3 that have already come up in different ways, 3 specific techniques that I saw again and again when I was interviewing people that I think speak to both the resilience is common idea and the flexibility idea, is social support. I mean, we already talked a bit about relationships. I'm just struck, you know, even in my own personal experience, but especially in the guests, how many people told me that finding other people who understand what they're going through, who get them, is a gift beyond words. It somehow makes like change and comfort possible. You know, I'm thinking of, I interviewed patients, multiple sclerosis patients, who said this about finding a support group. I interviewed veterans who said this. I interviewed a cancer survivor who, you know, when she had to cut off her hair because she was going through chemo, she talked about how she threw a party, a family party, and they played a song called "I'm Not My Hair" as she, you know, had her cousin buzz her head. That sort of social support is incredibly, incredibly valuable. And so social support was one of the major themes that I encountered. Another one was mobilizing past experiences. You know, in the spirit of resilience is all around us and inherent in us. Many of us can look back on our lives, especially, I've seen this especially used with older folks who have a lot of past experience to draw on, and find the moments when they were challenged in the past, and, you know, revisit the tools and strategies and the systems that help them to be resilient in those moments. I was reminded, I interviewed a couple of psychologists, Mount Sinai psychologists, who went to Puerto Rico in the wake of an earthquake. And they said that it was really helpful to people to, again, maybe it sounds intuitive, but to really bring up the past and bring up past earthquakes, as many people had been through this before, and to talk about it, make that a part of an active conversation, as opposed to simply assuming that, oh, well, they'll you know, remember and be able to deploy those tools again. And then the third piece that I heard a lot, and this ties to, you know, there's so many different threads here that we're putting together, was gratitude. You know, gratitude is a practice. I heard this from meditation instructors. I heard it from positive psychology practitioners. You know, our brains have a negativity bias. Many of us, we're certainly drawn to the things that aren't working. So to make it a practice to return to the things that are working, the parts of our bodies that are working, you know, the beauty in the relationships around us that are working, that are supporting us, is something that I've just encountered again and again from all sorts of people. And these are both from people who, you know, meditation instructors, but also from, you know, ordinary folks who, you know, in the course of their resilience journey encountered this idea of gratitude and turned it into a habit that was really, really helpful for them. So in terms of, you know, preparing, there's only so much we can do truly before an adverse experience to, you know, be ready. But I think sort of familiarizing yourself with those and with many of the things, gosh, in this conversation that have been mentioned so far, and, you know, maybe having that exercise habit, knowing what it's like to try meditating, just having some familiarity with these different tools, I think that is a piece of advice I would absolutely want to impart. it doesn't mean, it's sort of taking that that wide approach to resilience. So again, that's what I wanted to share in this bit. So in the spirit of gratitude, thank you all so much again, fellow panelists and organizers, and all of you who are watching and listening, for being here.
Thank you, John. As you point out, we just already have such a rich array of ideas to talk about. I know we're not going to have time to cover very many of them, but one I do want to ask about, and Melinda, I'm going to start with you. You talked about being aware of how easy it is to get stuck in internal dialogue. And I think when you and I spoke before this, you talked about, since the pandemic, being very intentional about teaching both or multiple perspectives on an issue or a topic as a way of trying to help students think more flexibly. And I think this idea of thinking more flexibly is so important, and probably you all might have something helpful to say about that. But Melinda, how about if you get us started? What have you learned as an educator that does help build that capacity? Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think because I work in an English classroom, it's so much easier when you look at characters and you look at the different characters and what perspective they're coming at the same situation from. So this book, Dear Martin by Nick Stone that I mentioned earlier, you have about 4 main young adult characters and various situations that happen. Well, how might this young person be viewing this experience based on his past experiences or her past experiences, her family life, her or his relationship with the other people? And then I think you have to be intentional, because it's easy for us to identify with the character who looks like us. But going outside and looking at it from the main character's perspective, who might be a different gender or a different skin color or a different socioeconomic group, what barriers might that young person have faced that you've never faced before? And how might their approach be different for yours? And even like in that particular book, there's the young man gets arrested, and he really struggles with the racial profiling that happens for him. And we then looked at how police are trained and looked at it from the police person's perspective, and why might the policeman have assumed malintent for that young person. And so I think it was really good for us to approach the same scenario from multiple sides.
That's excellent. Chris, anything you want to add about how you help build flexibility?
I think Melinda has said it so beautifully, and I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge that I learned so much from what each of you shared, Melinda and John, and particularly like the questions that you guys have raised that for all of us to answer for ourselves. I think what's coming to my mind as an English major, I might add, Melinda, is how, yeah, we all are, kind of buying into telling ourselves different stories all the time. And sometimes a helpful kind of question to ask ourselves is, what story am I buying into now? What do I get if I buy into this? And just kind of noticing that, and noticing that narrative is not a fact, but a story that we can either hold lightly or tightly, can really help with that flexibility piece.
Great, thank you. John, I want to ask you something that's just right next to that. I listened to your interview with George Bonanno, and you and he were talking about this idea of flexibility and trying different strategies. And you used the metaphor, and he was kind of taken with it, of an engineering problem. And that an engineer is kind of neutral about, there's no valence to the solution. You just try something and evaluate, and then you try something else and evaluate. And I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about How do we get good at even doing that evaluating? How do we know if what we're doing isn't working? Because sometimes we're just so in it, that we don't, it's hard to step back and even look at that.
That's such a good question. I mean, I think I have sort of a two-part answer that comes to mind. The first is we've talked about mindfulness already in this session, and I think that practicing that ability to have critical distance from the involuntary thoughts and feelings that come through our mind is a really important sort of first step to at least establishing a space in your day and in your life where you can see these powerful feelings that come through us and just be able to move your perspective a little bit and practice that. Just be able to look at it maybe from this angle and to practice what we sometimes call reframing. And so that's the first part of what I would say. And then the second part, I think, goes to social support. I mean, I think anybody who's been through something hard and is working on their way back to a new normal benefits from having that the counsel of people who know and love you and care about you and can to help you course correct when any one of these strategies becomes maladaptive. That's what I would say. So I think on the list, absolutely, this is such a huge one. I mean, you can't emphasize this enough. On the list of things that you can do before adversity is to just really invest in your relationships.
Great. Well, time has flown with all of these wonderful, rich ideas that you have contributed to our conversation. So, but I do want to end with asking each of you to answer the same question. And John, I'm going to start with you. And that is, if you could offer one final piece of advice today about cultivating resilience, perhaps a practice that you found to be most effective or a perspective that's particularly inspiring to you, what would that be and why?
I would say invest in relationships. I would say, how do I even say it? I mean, this feels like so much in life I feel like I don't learn. Like one of the few things that I feel like I actually have learned in life is just how important it's like what it all comes down to is who you're walking this journey with. And for, the practical reasons of adversity, but just like the sheer enjoyment of life. I think, I have tried to search for I have tried to make all the things that I do that strengthen my relationships. I've tried to consciously include other people, and whether that's people that are already in my life or new people, in what otherwise could easily be solitary passions. And I think that's not only, as I said, kind of brings joy and richness to life, but is also hugely protective in terms of resilience.
Thank you. Chris, final piece of advice from you.
I mean, I'm going to sound like a copycat, but I mean, John, I think you just hit the nail on the head. I mean, I guess I would add, because mostly in the spirit of what you've shared, John, about the importance of being open to multiple different practices, I would say, invest in what matters to you most. Do the things you would do if you weren't trying to control how you are thinking and feeling, and just do that. And I think for most of us, number one on the list is relationships in terms of what makes life most rewarding. It certainly is for me. And the only thing I would also add is that also includes the relationship you have with yourself, and making space for that. That's probably for me the biggest challenge at the moment. Is sometimes I'm so drawn to relationships, and I feel that I get so much out of them that I sometimes don't carve out the space that I need from my own relationship with myself, and to find ways of restoring that. So making sure that relationship with yourself is part of that too.
That's great, Chris. Thank you so much. Melinda, you get the last word.
Well, I think I'm going to go with both of your answers and say that for me, sometimes even those relationships are with fictional characters. And I think that sounds maybe a little silly, but I can think of a few books I've read in the last few years that really impacted me, these characters, and that their resiliency, their strength in facing adversity almost gave me the permission myself to honor my own emotions and needs. And if this character can do it, and look what happened to Nan, then maybe I also can face this and try something different, put myself in an uncomfortable situation for the opportunity for growth. So I think that the advice would be open to where that inspiration is coming from. It might be from the person you are choosing to walk the journey with and the relationships that are physically close to you, but it also might be from a character in a novel, and it might be from young person, or it just could be anywhere, and just being kind of attuned to what you're what's speaking to you.
What a great way for us to end. Thank you all so much for sharing so many wonderful thoughts and practices and strategies with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.